For most of human history, roughly 1 in every 4 babies did not live to see their first birthday. In some prehistoric populations, the number climbs closer to 1 in 3. And here is the part that will make your stomach turn a huge share of those deaths clustered in a single predictable window every single year. The cold months. Late autumn into deep winter. A season so consistently lethal to infants that anthropologists can actually see it in the bones, thousands of years later, layered into burial sites like a calendar of grief. Now, if you grew up in the modern world, your brain has a ready-made explanation for this. You probably already filled it in. You're thinking they killed them, right? That's the story we've all absorbed somewhere along the way. Weak baby, harsh winter, not enough food, so the tribe makes a cold decision and the baby is left in the snow. It's the version you've seen in documentaries, in novels, in offhand jokes about Sparta. It feels true because it sounds brutal, and prehistory is supposed to sound brutal. But here is the problem. When you actually look at the evidence, the bones, the burial sites, the isotope studies, the ethnographic records of cold climate peoples who survived into the modern era, that story falls apart almost completely. The data says something different, something stranger, something honestly a lot sadder and a lot more human. So tonight I want to walk you through this like a case file, piece by piece. Because the truth about what happened to those babies isn't a single dramatic act. It's a slow, layered tragedy built out of biology, climate, social structure, and one specific evolutionary mismatch that still shapes how your body works right now, in this room, watching this video. Let's start with the first piece of evidence, because this is the one that breaks the popular story before we even get going. Archaeologists have been excavating prehistoric infant burials for over a century, and what they have found again and again across Europe, Siberia, the Levant, and northern Asia is care, not disposal. Care. Tiny bodies wrapped in furs, beads placed near the chest, red ochre dusted across the bones, the same pigment used in adult burials of high status. In one site in central Russia, a place called Sunghir, 2 children were buried around 30,000 years ago, with more than 10,000 carved mammoth ivory beads stitched onto their clothing. 10,000. Each one took an estimated hour to make. Do the math on that. Someone, a whole community, spent the equivalent of months of labor decorating 2 children who died young. That is not the behavior of people who saw weak infants as disposable. That is grief. Heavy, expensive, communal grief. So if the babies weren't being killed, what was happening? Because the deaths were real. The seasonal spike was real. The bones don't lie about that part. This is where the popular explanation falls apart and the actual investigation begins. The first real clue comes from a field you wouldn't expect: vitamin D research. Modern doctors started noticing in the early 2000s that infant mortality, even today, has a quiet seasonal pattern. Babies born in late autumn, in high-latitude countries, have measurably worse outcomes in their first few months than babies born in spring. The reason is sunlight. A pregnant mother's vitamin D levels in the 3rd trimester shape her baby's bone development, immune system, and lung capacity. If the final months of pregnancy happen in the dark half of the year, the baby arrives with a quieter immune system and softer bones. In a modern hospital, this is a footnote. In a prehistoric cave, with no antibiotics and a respiratory infection sweeping through the group, it's a death sentence. And here is where it gets worse. Prehistoric people, especially in northern climates, spent the winter months packed into small, smoke-filled shelters, hide tents, cave mouths, sod-roofed pits. The fire that kept them alive also filled the air with particulate matter, soot, ash, fine carbon. Modern studies on indoor cooking smoke in developing countries show that infants exposed to this kind of air have dramatically higher rates of pneumonia. Their tiny lungs simply can't clear it. So picture a baby born in October, already low on vitamin D, already developmentally fragile, now breathing wood smoke for 16 hours of darkness a day, for 4 straight months. You're not looking at murder. You're looking at suffocation by environment. And the bones confirm it. When paleopathologists examine the skeletons of prehistoric infants who died in winter, They find signs of respiratory illness, rib lesions, sinus inflammation preserved in the skull, evidence of chronic stress in the tooth enamel of children who survived just long enough to start growing teeth. These aren't babies who were left in the snow. These are babies who got sick, quietly, in their mother's arms, next to a fire that was simultaneously saving and slowly poisoning them. Now, I want you to hold that image for a second, because the next piece of evidence layers right on top of it, food. This is the part everyone assumes they understand. Winter equals scarcity. Scarcity equals starving babies. End of story. But again, the data says something different. Prehistoric hunter-gatherers in cold climates were actually surprisingly good at winter food storage. We have evidence of meat caches buried in permafrost, of fish smoked and dried by the thousands, of fat rendered and stored in animal stomachs, like ancient Tupperware. The adults, in most cases, weren't starving. Isotope studies of adult bones from late Pleistocene sites in Europe show consistent protein intake year-round. The grown-ups were eating. The babies, though, the babies were a different problem. Because here's the thing nobody tells you about breastfeeding in a cold climate hunter-gatherer society. It depends entirely on the mother's body fat. A nursing mother needs roughly 500 extra calories a day to maintain her milk supply, and those calories have to come from somewhere. In a good summer, with berries and roots and fresh meat, no problem. In February, in a snowbound camp, with the stored fat reserves running low and the mother herself losing weight, the milk thins. Then it slows. Then, in the worst cases, it stops. This is called lactation failure, and it is one of the most under-discussed killers in human prehistory. The mother isn't neglecting the baby. She is, biologically, running out of fuel to produce food. And in a world before formula, before goat's milk, before anything you could substitute, a baby who couldn't nurse had maybe a week. Sometimes less. Anthropologists studying the Inuit, the Sami, and the Siberian Evenki in the 19th and early 20th centuries documented this pattern directly. Winter babies in lean years often died not from cold, not from violence, but from a slow fade as their mother's milk gave out. The communities knew it, they grieved it, they had songs about it. In some Sami traditions, a baby who died in the deep dark of winter was said to have gone back to the snow, not as a euphemism for being abandoned, but as a way of saying the world had taken what the mother could no longer give. That distinction matters. The popular story makes the parents the villains. The actual evidence makes the parents the second victims. Now, and this is important, I'm not going to pretend infanticide never happened in prehistory. It did. There are documented cases, mostly in extreme scarcity events, mostly involving twins in cultures that couldn't support two simultaneous nursing infants, and almost always treated by the community as a tragedy rather than a routine. But the evidence suggests it was rare, far rarer than the popular imagination would have you believe. And it was almost never about a baby being too weak. It was about a mother being too depleted to nurse two, or a community being too depleted to feed everyone. The decision when it happened was about resources, not about judging the infant. The myth of the weak baby left to die in the cold is almost entirely a modern projection. We invented it because it makes prehistory feel safely distant. If they were the kind of people who did that, we tell ourselves, then they were nothing like us. The truth is the opposite. They were exactly like us. That's why this hurts to learn. Let's keep building the case. Because there's another layer here that the popular story completely misses. And this one is going to change how you think about your own body. Human babies, compared to almost every other mammal, are born absurdly early. Developmentally, you should be cooked for another 9 to 12 months inside the womb before you come out. A newborn horse stands within an hour. A newborn deer runs within a day. A newborn human can't lift its own head for 3 months. We are biologically premature by design. Anthropologists call this secondary altriciality, and it exists because our brains got so big that if babies stayed in the womb any longer, they wouldn't fit through the birth canal at all. So evolution made a trade. Get the baby out early while the head still fits, and finish the development on the outside. This worked beautifully. In tropical and temperate climates, where outside was warm, food was steady, and a half-cooked infant could finish growing in relative safety. Then, around 70, Zeus years ago, humans started moving into the cold, and this is the mismatch. This is the part the bones and the burials and the breastfeeding data are all pointing toward. We took a tropical reproductive strategy, a strategy that assumes a warm, food-rich environment for the baby's first year, and we marched it into the Ice Age, into shelters with thin walls, into seasons with no fresh food, into latitudes where the sun barely rises for months at a time. Our biology never caught up. It still hasn't. Even now, in 2026, with central heating and pediatricians, late winter babies in cold countries still show measurably different health outcomes than spring babies. The ghost of that mismatch is still inside you. So when you ask what happened to babies too weak to survive winter, the honest answer is most of them weren't weak. They were normal human infants, born into an environment their species was never evolved for, cared for by parents doing everything they knew how to do, and lost to a combination of darkness, smoke, thinning milk, and a respiratory infection that a modern antibiotic would clear in 3 days. And here is the moment where the case really turns. Because if you've been following the evidence with me, you've probably already noticed something uncomfortable. This isn't a story about ancient cruelty. This is a story about ancient love operating inside an impossible system. Think about what it actually took to bury a baby with 10,000 ivory beads. Think about a mother nursing through the dark months, losing her own body weight, knowing, because they knew, these people were not stupid, knowing that her milk was thinning and there was nothing she could do about it. Think about a father sitting in a smoke-filled shelter in February, watching his child cough, with no concept of bacteria or vitamin D or pneumonia, just the slow dread that this winter, like so many others, was going to take something from him. These were not people who didn't care. These were people who cared with absolutely no tools. And this is the piece I really want you to sit with, because it changes everything about how we read this period. The high infant mortality of prehistory wasn't a sign that ancient humans didn't value their children. It was a sign of how much the world cost. Every surviving adult in a prehistoric community had, statistically, lost siblings. Many had lost their own children. Grief was not occasional, it was structural. It was woven into the calendar, into the songs, into the burial rituals, into the very way people related to each other. Some anthropologists now argue that the elaborate communal nature of prehistoric grief, the shared burials, the symbolic objects, the red ochre, the long mourning practices we see in the archaeological record, exists precisely because the losses were so frequent. You don't build that kind of cultural infrastructure around rare events. You build it around things that happen every winter. So let me bring the case to its turning point. Because there is one more piece of evidence, and this is the one that, when I first read it, made me put the book down and stare at the wall for a while. In several Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe, archaeologists have found something specific in infant burials: milk teeth. Not the baby's own, the mother's, or sometimes an older sibling's. Adult teeth, deliberately placed near the infant's body. The interpretation, the one most researchers now lean toward, is that these were tokens of connection. A piece of the living person left with the lost child so that the baby would not be alone in whatever came next. Ride that again. A grown person in the middle of a freezing winter, in a world without writing, without religion as we'd recognize it, without any of the comforts we use to process death, pulled a tooth from their own mouth to bury with their baby. That is the evidence. That is what was happening to the babies who didn't survive winter. They were not being discarded. They were being mourned with a depth that most modern grief rituals can't match. So why does the other story, the cold, brutal, leave them in the snow story, survive so stubbornly in our culture? Part of it is Victorian-era anthropology, which loved to paint prehistoric people as savage in order to flatter the present. Part of it is a few mistranslated classical sources about Sparta, which weren't even prehistoric and weren't even accurate about Sparta. Part of it is the entertainment industry, which needs prehistoric drama to be loud and visible rather than quiet and devastating. And part of it, honestly, is that the real story is harder to sit with. A baby left in the snow is a villain story, easy to process, easy to condemn. A baby who fades in its mother's arms because the milk ran out and the smoke filled the lungs is just a tragedy. And tragedies don't give us anyone to blame, which is why we keep replacing them with myths. Here's the other piece that doesn't get said often enough. The modern struggle to keep babies alive in their first year. The anxiety, the obsessive monitoring, the cultural weight we put on infant safety isn't a sign of modern overprotection. It's a sign that for the first time in our species' history, we actually can keep them alive. Every alarm on a baby monitor, every vaccine, every prenatal vitamin, every warm room in February is a quiet answer to 100,000 years of winters our ancestors couldn't win. If you've ever felt like modern parenting is too intense, too vigilant, too haunted, there is a reason for that. You are running ancient software in a new environment. The vigilance is older than the comfort. Your nervous system still expects to lose the child. It doesn't know yet that the smoke has cleared and the milk is steady and the antibiotics work. That mismatch is not a personal failure. It is a 70,000-year-old inheritance. So when you ask the original question, what happened to babies too weak to survive winter? The real answer is this. Most of them weren't weak. They were caught in a season their species had never evolved for, cared for by people who loved them with the entire force of a 100,000-year-old bond, lost to forces no one in that shelter could name or fight. And then they were grieved, carefully, expensively, with ivory and ochre and pulled teeth and songs we'll never get to hear. That is the case. That is what the evidence actually shows. And it is so much heavier and so much more human than the story we inherited. If you've ever felt the weight of caring for someone fragile in a world that doesn't make it easy, your ancestors felt that too. Every single one of them. That's not a wound. That's a lineage. You come from people who refused to stop loving children the world kept taking from them. That is the part of prehistory you actually inherited. Not the cold, the care. And it's still in you.